may have, or other countries in the region which they are targeting, may have a different perspectives or different perception of human rights, democracy. So we'll have to be careful that once we are going beyond it, we'll have to be extra careful. We should not just undermine the understanding of other countries about democracy and democratic values or democratization, human rights. Because once we are targeting them or you increasing the number, because without increasing the number, we cannot, I will not say contain China, but manage China. So we'll have to include other countries also. This is one factor, and this is very relevant. Now you are, Nilesh, you talked about uh, going beyond security. Of course, in security also, there is still not a single joint statement has been issued by the Quad. So this is one of the limitations, you can say, or one of the challenges of Quad. So that we have to work out. To what all areas they are going to work on. So that once you are doing that, so what United States in one of its bills or in its one of its laws, you can say, has stated that it wants to just target and expand the economic sphere where it can bring the huge middle class consumers of goods. And according to one study, 59% of the world's middle class are going to stay there. So once you have to target their fisheries, already have been done, and other resources already being talked about when we discuss about South China, Chinese aggression or Chinese aggressive behavior in South China Sea, how it is interfering in uh, other countries exploiting resources, especially fisheries. Vietnam has been one of the victims. So this is one important area which is going to have take place. America is also talking about acceleration of nuclear and ballistic missile capabilities of North Korea and increased presence of ISIS, which it feels that Quad may address in the future. Where do we stand? This is the question which I think we have to address. No doubt, North Korea's aggressive behavior or increased proliferation is matter of concern for the world. But there is a link. There is a link, and its link goes to Pakistan also. So when we are discussing about proliferation, I think we should not just focus only on North Korea. We should expand its scope and also take into account Pakistani behavior. So this is also very important. Sometimes what happens, we just see what North Korea is doing in East Asia, and we forget about other parts of the world. So that I think we'll have to bring into account. And third factor which is relating to security is about ISIS. America is quite interested in understanding and exchanging information about ISIS, how it is increasing its presence in Indo-Pacific region, how people trained from West Asia are coming to the region, what are their resources, what are the resources of the countries living in the region, and how we can jointly counter it. So I think things are going beyond China. So we have to also think about how we can also work together on these areas. During pandemic, all the countries also talked about health security. So this is also one of the areas which I think we can discuss and how we can cooperate. So I am saying the sky is the limit. We can keep pointing out different areas and we can work together. And we are already working together. So I think there is much scope, and we have to refine it and see it how better we can work in the future. This is I'm just leaving it here. I will touch other issues during the
Thank you,
question which you are planning to do.
thank you, Rajiv ji. You know, you have raised very valid points, especially from the Indian perspective, that how China is extending its help towards, the non-state actors as well in Pakistan. So we should also, think about that. Plus, proliferation is a big issue, and Pakistan is a bigger culprit than probably North Korea. So world need to focus on, this element as well. So, with all these perspectives, let's move towards Mr. Wadhwa, who dealt with the Eastern, diplomacy of ours as Secretary in the External Affairs Ministry. Uh, so, you have heard two perspectives and two very rich perspectives about quadrilateral. Uh, as a secretary in External Affairs Ministry, you have dealt with many of these issues. So tell us, your thought process. That how do you see? Do you see, this friendship of quadrilateral can extend, and like what Rajiv ji was saying, to more areas which can bring more prosperity to the region. After all, this is more than half of world's GDP. So can we look at these security apparatus as well as economics with a single vision? So what is your thought process, sir? Mr. Wadhwa, please unmute your mic and start the remarks.
Thank you very much, Anilesh. Pleasure to be here. Much has been said about China, of course, and there is no doubt that the Chinese aggression in South China Sea and the Senkakus on the line of actual control with India around Taiwan and policies in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, and then the economic actions taken against Australia. All this has actually galvanized the Quad nations even more than in the past, and I would say invoked a sense of urgency in dealing with the problem at hand. And I would agree with Malcolm when he said that the Quad members will need to work together to safeguard their interests individually and collectively. Now, what can the Quad do to respond? And also, how does the future go for the Quad? So I would start by saying that despite the differences in threat perception and the risk tolerance and also the military capabilities, also the strategic culture, the cooperation amongst the Quad countries will continue to deepen as long as there are these challenges, especially the challenge of China, which is threatening the liberal rules-based order that benefits all the four countries. And so far, what has happened as far as the Quad is concerned, that there are areas of cooperation which has made steady progress. So what are the areas of cooperation? If you look at that, it's essentially infrastructure projects and connectivity, also the cybersecurity cooperation, intelligence sharing, counterterrorism, and maritime domain awareness. All five of them were those areas where the Quad countries could see a common interest. So similarly, some more common interests in the future will need to be found and focused upon. If we look at the boosting confidence amongst the Quad countries, I think it's very important that in the South China Sea, first of all, the Quad will need to work with countries of the region like Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Philippines, so that they can assert their own maritime rights time and again in all the zones that are illegally being contested by China. Also, in the future, the Quad will need to build on the gains of maritime domain awareness that's within themselves and also with the ASEAN countries who are facing the brunt of Chinese aggression. Because unless the ASEAN is comfortable with the Quad idea of security, not much progress can be made. So the Quad states should step up efforts to improve their own joint interoperability, intelligence, surveilling and reconnaissance capabilities, and also share logistics for power projection and enhance the joint development of defense technology. All these are one bunch of ideas which can go together. Also, space capabilities, as Malcolm pointed out, should be pooled into this effort, which we haven't done so far. And an expansion of the Malabar exercises now is a given corollary after India and Australia agreed upon an interoperability agreement at the summit meeting, which was held on 4th of May. A similar agreement between India and Japan is also on the cards, and also a slew of such agreements are in place with the United States as far as India is concerned. So what is needed is to undertake some more naval exercises between the two or three, if not all partners. Quad countries must articulate their faith in the freedom of navigation and overflights at regular intervals. And they should also concentrate on redesigning of the China-centered supply chains in the region, because that will help in the Indo-Pacific economic recovery. It will help in creating alternate dependencies. Because over-reliance on China for manufacturing and production has shown up their own vulnerabilities and also the vulnerabilities of the ASEAN countries. The dominance of China, for example, in rare earth minerals, processing of lithium and key components in electronics and power equipment all point to the need for diversification and minimizing this dependency. And here I'd like to talk about a new idea which has come up, which is about the possibility of a trade and investment agreement between the Quad countries. Now, of course, this is not something which will happen overnight, but since we are talking about creating new value chains, we will have to start talking about this because in any case, all these four economies are quite complementary. The other three countries are quite engaged with China, looking at the Indian market anyway. The trade and investment, flows and levels between all the four countries of the Quad is quite substantive. And there has been a demand or a desire on their part to make sure that there is a market access in India, and as far as India is concerned, to have access to finance and technology. So I think all these issues can be met if these talks can start and it can begin with the logistics and supply chain arrangements. Of course, there is a possibility also that these discussions could proceed on the lines of the Quad plus 3 format. We had Vietnam, New Zealand, and Republic of Korea, which met with the Quad to discuss concerted action in dealing with the pandemic and cooperation in health and vaccines, as well as equipment, logistics, movement of their nationals, also creating value chains in essentials like pharmaceuticals. This, by all accounts, has been a very focused and productive discussion, and the Quad Plus was able to meet successfully for many weeks in a row. The collaboration between India and Australia in the field of vaccines is actually a model which should be followed and replicated. And the Quad should be ready to go beyond discussions on traditional security threats and also enhance their role in multilateral institutions, and then go on to talk about how they could contribute to reforming of the global system. And they could begin with the WHO, which India is going to chair in the near future. I would say that the Quad countries must cooperate now on standard setting and create a pool of their funds, which they in any case have at their disposal for this region. And that includes the coming together of the Blue Dot Initiative, upholding the voluntary quality infrastructure initiative standards, which are advocated by the G20, and offer that as a viable alternative to Chinese BRI for the small and vulnerable states which are being targeted by China. This also requires, in my view, a few pilot projects to be chosen for bilateral or trilateral cooperation at the earliest. And finally, I think the Quad needs to meet in the immediate future at the ministerial level, or soon after that at the summit level, to signal its intent to work together. That's not happened at all. And the time has come now to put that idea into practice. It can also, in my view, create a revolving secretariat, not involving permanent expenditure, because that will be difficult to meet given the times that we are in. But just to carry out coordination work between virtual meetings, we're working on specific topics and also preparing some discussion papers. Finally, I would also talk about one idea which the Quad started off with, the tsunami cooperation, back when it started in 2004. So HADR is one area which should be focused upon. That's something which will find traction also amongst the ASEAN and the countries of the Pacific Island states. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Wadhwa. It was really good, wonderful insight. Thank you very much. So here, I bring in Mr. Mattu. All his, most part of his life, he tried to build up and deepen the relationship between India and Australia. So if we look around, US has a very good and deep relationship with Japan. US has a deeper relationship with Australia. US has, love and hate relationship with India. And in last 20, 25 years, we have seen the relationship deepening between India and US. Similarly, India and Japan, because of the friendship between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, it's getting deepened. But what we are now seeing is probably, India and Australia getting deeper. Our cooperation, there are a few friendly conversations between our prime ministers. And recently, we also had a prime minister level, a small summit. So, do you think that for survival and for existence of Quad, it is very critical for India and Australia to deepen their relationship, not only on the security aspect, but also on the economic front, so that all four countries are equally confident of each other before building up the contours. Mr. Mattu, your perspective. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Anilesh ji, and thank you all the other speakers, Malcolm and Anil Wadhwa and Rajiv Nayan, who have presented very fine perspectives of various aspects of the Quad. What I'll do, Anilesh ji, is, with your permission, is of course peg it to Australia and then look at the larger picture. Let me say that one of the remarkable things that happened yesterday was that the Australian High Commissioner in India, the Honorable Barry O'Farrell, responded to the Chinese ambassador's speech at the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi, where the Chinese ambassador gave obviously the Chinese perspective on the border conflict with India, where Barry O'Farrell actually, for the first time in several decades, came out clearly that any unilateral change of the status quo on the border is unacceptable. This reflects a major shift in Australian policy, which has always gravitated towards balance rather than tilts. In the past, as you know, Australian policy towards whether it's India and Pakistan or India and China has been less than forthcoming as far as New Delhi is concerned. In fact, during the years of the Cold War, Australia and India were on opposing sides of the Cold War, as it were, and there was a great deal of circumspection and tension between the two countries, despite a congruence of values. There was a perception that our strategic interests do not merge or converge. Therefore, there were huge diplomatic differences which came out in the open periodically, including after India's nuclear tests. So there has been this period which is reflected finally in Barry O'Farrell's statement, where there's been a growing warmth between India and Australia in the post-Cold War period, but more remarkably, since Tony Abbott, the Conservative Prime Minister, not very much liked or very popular within Australia itself, made this opening towards Modi. Modi was the first Prime Minister of India who visited Australia in 28 years after Rajiv Gandhi's meeting with Bob Hawke. And it was a spectacular success. I hosted Prime Minister Modi in Melbourne, and I remember the great reception that he got from the captains of industry, the CEOs of various Australian companies. Abbott came to India, followed by Malcolm Turnbull, and followed by this virtual summit that you referred to between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Scott Morrison. So there is this growing developments which are reflected, as Malcolm pointed out, in greater sense of military coordination, whether it's a mutual logistics agreement which has been signed during the virtual summit, or the de facto invitation which has to, for the Malabar exercises, which will translate, I think, whether it's this year or the next, into a de jure permanent inclusion of Australia within the Malabar exercises. But that relationship in some ways reflects is reflective and exemplifies the Quad itself. If you look at the past, present, and future of the Quad, the past, I think Rajiv Ji, who's a great scholar of Japan, pointed out that it was Shinzo Abe who was first most enthusiastic. John Howard was enthusiastic as well, but India was a little cagey about the whole idea of a Quad. Then when India became enthusiastic, you had the great Kevin Rudd, who was enthusiastic about everything in life except alienating the Chinese. So the Quad idea never took off, despite the fact that 13 years ago, it was Shinzo Abe who proposed this idea. And in some incremental form, there were baby steps taken. Now, if you look at the present, what's happened? Let's look at the elephant in the room. It's China. And everyone's actually referred to China, how much you might try to hide away from that. The reality is that the Chinese have defied all the benevolent views that sinologists attributed to them, or the Chinese attributed to themselves in terms of Confucian thought that there would be a peaceful rise, and what sinologists assumed that there would be a gradual socialization of the Chinese into international institutions. No, China is today a revisionist, hegemonic, potentially belligerent power. As long as you don't accept it with the same clarity that George F. Kennan had when he wrote that famous article on containment as Mr. X, you'll never be able to address the main issue at hand. As long as we go on dilly-dallying, but on the one hand, on the one hand, we have the strong relationship with China, but on the other hand, there is this potential of China turning out a revisionist power. No, you have to accept that the idea behind the Quad today is to contain China, economically and militarily. Economically, you have to strategically, you have to decouple yourself from China, and militarily, you have to build vertical relationships within and expand as far as you can go. I know today, in a rather provocative paper, Samir Saran of the Observer Research Foundation said that 4 Quad members exercise in Ladakh. Now, that would be probably upping the ante as far as Beijing goes. But in that germ of an idea lies the fact that you have to be risk takers. If you have to contain a superpower, you can't sit on the fence, and you can't then pretend that China is not going to see you as potential adversaries. China is viewing you as in adversarial terms, and you have to therefore, in terms of your grand strategy, equip yourself with all the ammunition at your disposal. Interoperability exercises intelligence sharing. Now, intelligence sharing, there have been again episodic intelligence sharing. But Malcolm probably knows this better because the Strategic Policy Institute is so deeply embedded within Canberra's establishment that the Five Eyes wouldn't let India into the rear view of their computers where there is real-time intelligence sharing. But that's the kind of risk-taking that you have to do. You have to open up your intelligence sharing on a real-time basis with countries like India. Similarly, I think India has to stop being cagey or coy about including Australia, including Japan, or even including the United States in far more robust military maneuvers which build up interoperability. That is in terms of deepening. Expansion, I mean, Anil Wadhwa and others have spoken about all the other countries that you could include. It originally started as an arc of democracy, but as you know, values are a nice, convenient way of clothing your ulterior motives. So you can give it the epitaph, or you can give it a certain covering of calling it an arc of democracy, by including some democratic or ostensibly democratic countries from within ASEAN, but it is China. It is it's a formation, and I won't go too much in terms of semantics, whether it's going to be a military alliance or whether it's going to be what is the shape or form. Let it move organically. What you need to do is to expand to include more countries which have the same sense of apprehension about China. And you have to deepen your relationship to the point that you're sharing real-time intelligence. And then in terms of the value chains, that's going to be the most difficult one. Australia's prosperity is only due to one factor: China's thirst for natural resources. And that, of course, has been cooling off, but it still is a big relationship. And China can arm twist Australians more easily, than it can arm twist Japan or India economically. And we now have evidence that the Chinese have also been incidentally interfering in America in the electoral process, as well as setting up think tanks. Wasn't there a report, Malcolm, you'll correct me if I am saying something outrageous, that the ASP also gets major funding from some Chinese? It doesn't.
There's a, shall we say, a stoked controversy about ASP funding being promoted by Chinese government sources and pro-Chinese groups to try and discredit ASP. But all our funding is very clearly laid out. Half of it is from government, half of it is from commercial sponsors, and the rest is revenue from events. And it's all very clearly laid out in the ASP annual report for everyone to see.
Glad for that.
There's no suggestion that the CIA is funding us or anything like that.
No, I do hope that the CIA and the RNW start funding you rather than the Chinese, but that's a separate thought off the record. But I'm glad to hear that there is a arm's distance that you have with the Chinese. And I wish that some parliamentarians exercise the same arm's length distance that ASPI does. But the larger point is that the Chinese have been using every tool in the business. Anilesh ji, if today you believe that the Chinese influence in India is limited to one political party or one newspaper or a certain groups of individuals, you're mistaken. It's insidious, but it's all pervasive. We keep talking about, and the RSS and the Sangh Parivar obviously has an obsession with talking about the ISI and the Pakistani infiltration. It's the Chinese infiltration that you should be very cautious and careful about, because if you saw that, and Anil Wadhwa may have seen that 1960s film called Hamsaya, the Chinese spy is the sneakiest and the most insidious in terms of even their operation as early as the 60s, as shown in Bollywood. But that's not, the larger point is that strategic economic decoupling is going to be very difficult. Countries like Australia, countries like are going to be finding it most difficult, but even countries like Japan and India and the United States are not going to be easy to, it's not going to be easy to decouple yourself. Today, even today, as you pointed out, the medium that we use, the platform that we use, Zoom, has its origins in Chinese, in some Chinese entrepreneurs. Similarly, we were the last to finally, once they had entered Galwan Valley, did we finally say goodbye to Huawei? At least the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Britishers said no to Huawei, which is known to be an instrument of Chinese Communist Party. Thankfully, we have been a little more cagey about Alibaba. But what I'm suggesting is that it's not going to be easy to decouple it. What you need to do is to think this through and try and begin. You should have begun yesterday, but begin today to try and hire the finest economists who will tell you how these global supply chains can be changed or created in a way in which you will not completely firewall China, but at least not make yourself dependent on China.
Absolutely.
Therefore, in the future, I think the challenge, frankly, is huge. But as long as we keep shying away from the fact that China is an adversary, an economic power, as a strategic power, and that you need to put all the firepower at your display in the pursuit of containing this adversary, you will not rise to the task. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Mattu. In fact, I'm very much with you on this. And if I could add to Mr. Wadhwa's Quad +3, I would say Quad +4, and fourth country would be Taiwan. And if we study the way value chains are being created or were created in China, these were largely capitalists from Taiwan who, with the help of American money, they set up those big factories. And probably now the other three countries which Mr. Wadhwa was mentioning, like Vietnam, and if we could add Philippines also, and Australia, we all can benefit, if those investments move out of China. So maybe a time has come for Q +4 rather than Q +3, Mr. Wadhwa. Let's bring Malcolm back into this conversation. Sir, you have heard, the Indian perspectives on various issues related to Quad. What do you think that can be done to deepen the relationship between these four countries, especially if we talk about India and Australia? How can we deepen our relationship both on security as well as on the economic fronts? What sort of things do you see that in near future we can build a partnership upon? Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, let me deal with the economic side of things first. I think trade is central here. We do need to decouple our trading relationship with China. That's essential. If we don't do that, then they've got a chokehold on our economy, and that's unacceptable. We banned Huawei from bidding for our 5G networks because we knew that would give them control over our critical economic infrastructure and our critical information infrastructure. We ought to be able to take the same approach with trade. And so one of the first things that I would suggest is we start building up alternative supply chains within the Quad group. So we boost trade with India, we boost trade with the US and Japan, and we look at sovereign development of capability and manufacturing in Australia rather than relying everything on being sent offshore to be manufactured in China. Now that's challenging, I know, and I'm not an economist, I'm a strategic analyst. So, I may be speaking nonsense here from an economic perspective, but from my instinct, what we should be doing is trying to establish new supply chains within the Quad group so that we're all less dependent on China, and that undercuts their economic coercive ability against us, and it weakens their ability to pressure us. Because the Chinese are engaged in political warfare against Australia right at the moment. We're very much the canary in the coal mine, in the sense that if we buckle, the Chinese will know that if they press hard enough, other countries will buckle as well. And so we can't afford to do that. So we need to undercut their ability to place economic pressure on us. And that means things like selling our raw materials to India, getting more Indian students and Indian tourists to come to Australia, so that we're not just having universities purely reliant on Chinese students into their courses. The other thing I would say is that in terms of higher education, we need to be much more cautious about China's civil-military fusion and the efforts they're going to place people inside our critical universities to gain access to our knowledge that they can then use to boost the PLA's capability. What we should be doing is actually sharing knowledge with India and with Japan and the US. I see no problem with civil military fusion with those countries. I do see a problem with having China access to our crown jewels in terms of things like, research and development on hypersonics or autonomous systems or artificial intelligence, those sorts of things. So I think that in terms of the economics picture, the trade picture, the manufacturing picture, I think there's real opportunities there that we can push forward on between our four countries to actually strengthen the relationship that underpins the Quad. And then, of course, we build the defence and the security relationship on top of that. And part of that, if we're going down the path of common production and building new supply chains, then let's look at what could we do in terms of common capability. The Europeans, for example, built Eurofighter Typhoon as a common project within the EU. Why couldn't Australia, Japan, India and the United States develop a common project for future combat aircraft or future autonomous systems or future military space capabilities? To me, there is ample opportunity for our four countries to get together with the best brains that we have and start producing common capabilities for our defence forces that we can share between us. Intelligence sharing, I think, is something that we do need to move further along the track. Obviously, India is not part of the Five Eyes, and neither is Japan. But I do think that we can bring them into the mix. My area of research at ASPI is space policy and space security. And one of the key agreements that Australia has is the CSPO, the Combined Space Operations Agreement, which we have within the Five Eyes, but we've extended to France and Germany. So why couldn't we have a CSPO arrangement that we extend into the Quad, whereby Japan and India come into that, and we're sharing intelligence on space activities. India has a real concern in terms of Chinese counter-space and anti-satellite warfare capabilities, to the extent that it tested an ASAT last year to deter Chinese threats. So part of the way to counter the counter-space threat is by sharing of intelligence on an adversary's space activities. So I do think we need to bring Japan and India into the CSPO arrangements as a good first step. And the other point I would make is probably maritime domain awareness is something that is in the common interest of all. There is an opportunity there to build common capabilities, data fusion centers, networks, exploit autonomous systems. Australia is developing a system called Blue Bottle, which is a very low-cost unmanned surface vehicle, which you could deploy in large numbers across the Indian Ocean to monitor shipping activities in the region. Why don't we bring India and Japan in on that? So I guess what I'm saying is I'm putting forward very practical ideas about how the Quad states could work together to build some deliverable outcomes that would then strengthen our ability to do the more intangible things like stronger, closer foreign relations and defence policy arrangements and exchanges in terms of defence diplomacy. And that all has to be supported by stronger economic links that undercut and weaken China's coercive ability.
Yeah, that's a wonderful ideas, And from Indian side, I believe Rajiv Nayan would be very interested in many of these ideas. What do you say, Rajiv bhai? Unmute yourself, Rajiv bhai.
Yes, thank you very much. No, all very good ideas, right? Starting from data fusion. Unfortunately, when China and the United States started a trade war and America asked its companies to invest away from China and look towards other countries, and American companies just focused on Vietnam, some European countries, Australia, of course, and Korea. But once again review was made in the beginning of this year, what was realized that still American data companies are relying on China. They have not shifted their business away from China, other than greenfield projects and other companies. So I think data fusion and data companies, I think this is a great scope that all these four countries work together. Again, on R&D, Japan has got excellent technology base. Japan has got superb advanced technology infrastructure. But what is happening? Because of the population problem, they are not able to really think, or they are not able to plan what will happen in the future. So what has started happening? They have started relying on Chinese students to fill their labs, because their labs are empty. Same is situation about United States. Even they don't have trained human resources, so they are relying on immigration, migration, whatever you call it. But here, I think the role and opportunity for India comes in. India can fill in. We don't send our students to Japan. We just send our students to Western countries, especially United Kingdom and US. And there is a great opportunity for Indian and who can just do this role. So R&D is very important. Human resources, training of human resources, and this could be very futuristic. So you have to provide incentive. We try to work on this. And generally Indian students were hesitant because of the language problem. They felt that if we learn Japanese, work in Japan, and we don't get jobs, then we will be misfit elsewhere. So this is a big problem. So somehow we have to overcome this problem. Second issue is infrastructure. Now Pompeo again has started a new campaign how to take away all the supply chain companies away from China. And he discussed with Japan, with India, Australia, European countries. And the idea which is taking place inside United States is that somehow we have to not only cut down our reliance on China, but also our reliance on European countries. Because Europe has its own sense of problem. So India is to be relied on, or Vietnam or other ASEAN countries. So here comes the problem, the issue of capacity building. And in fact, this idea has been accepted, acknowledged by the US government, but how to implement it? How to do capacity building of Indian industry, Indian company, so that they can take up the job. So if business is coming and you don't have infrastructure, you don't have capacity, so you can't deliver. So what will happen? The same issue with Professor Bhattu raised. Again, you will have to go back to China. So I think all these complicated issues are also to be looked into. My point is, we should not feel pessimist. Why I'm saying we should not feel pessimist? Professor Mattu talked about cagey India. Yes, of course, India was cagey. Others were also. Even United States coined the phrase engagement. Even they were not for total containment. They were also for engagement of China. American security establishment wanted to contain China, but its business establishments, its trade establishment wanted to have engagement with China. And very importantly, the entire academic and knowledge industry of United States was heavily engaged by China. And there was a study by an Indian American. I don't know whether he's American or still an Indian. I don't know. He unfortunately passed away, from a Gujarati, a young scholar of 32 years age. And he conducted a study of major American think tanks and 15 American universities. And he realized that all these think tanks and universities are heavily funded not directly by China, but by some of the front companies. And then he correlated how is the policy, say, pronouncements coming, and found that almost 99.9% of these think tanks and universities, which were funded by Chinese, were speaking about, were taking pro-China line. So he said, this is the situation. So I think the complexity of democracy inside United States is also a big challenge. So I don't know how to overcome and how to do it. I think this is a complex problem. There are many complexities involved in the process, and we have to resolve some of these complexities. Only then we can succeed. If we don't, but we are moving now. All have realized that aggressive China cannot be taken on alone. We have to work together. United States is realizing it. India has started realizing it. That old traditional framework may not be working once China really becomes aggressive. Not aggressive only in behavior, but what it did in Ladakh. Suppose it starts doing that. So how are you going to stop it? We can say that we can stop it, but yeah, in reality, I think we'll have to struggle. Japan is finding this difficulty. So I think we all now are very happy to know that even Australia has become so realistic on China. And yesterday someone told me, I have not seen it, that China, Australian High Commissioner, in fact, engaged in Twitter spat with Chinese ambassador. So I think this is really heartening development, and I think we can talk a lot about it. So over to you.
So see, how this world is turning out. That two very, very, poised gentlemen, they are fighting with each other, and we are feeling it heartening. So, this means that this world is not normal right now. And probably this abnormal world is looking for solutions which will make this our society more secure and more, prosperous. So, Mr. Mattu, if you can come in here, one of the ideas which Rajiv was throwing is that how can we build up the human resources which can, replace the Chinese minds in not only US, Japan, or maybe in Australia. Can India and Australia develop a partnership specifically on education, where the Australian capital or Australian grey matter and Indian students, they can converge maybe with now we have a new education policy also, where we are welcoming the FDI in education. So can we build up a mechanism where we can build up human resources for all anti-China or anti-communist countries, so that their corporations can hire, these individuals? What do you think about this, sir?
I think absolutely, and it's a win-win relationship. If you look at the whole knowledge paradigm, and if you look at top-end research to vocational education, at every level, India and Australia have a win-win relationship. At the top end, in terms of the best quality research students, often Australia does not have the domestic capacity to have PhD students either in quantity or quality. The best Indian students have been going traditionally to Oxbridge or to the Ivy League. Now that the Australian dollar has also come down, and given that Australia till at least a few days ago had been able to deal with the pandemic and was showing signs of opening up before the West opened up, the best Indian minds, research students could be given scholarships, subsidies, or even on their own, they could go for high-end research. Let me give you two examples. One of the chief scientists working at the CISRO lab, high security lab, which is working on a vaccine against COVID, is Mr. Vasan, again from India. Similarly, one of the few field medal mathematicians in Australia is an Indian origin. But at that end, various states of Australia have taken initiative. Victoria, where I used to live, Melbourne, had actually instituted PhD research scholarships for cutting edge research by Indian students. But even in terms of vocational education, Australia has the best VET system anywhere in the world. And India, the problem, of course, is that it's a high-cost, low-volume model which operates in Australia. But offshore, low-cost, high-volume model for vocational education for Indian students can easily succeed. In fact, some of the Australian TAFE institutions have been experimenting with that as well. But a larger question is in terms of skilled migration. Now, India has beaten China as far as the largest source of skilled migrants into Australia. But we need to also have high network investment into Australia. The Chinese have bought real estate like nobody's business. There are anecdotally parts of Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, the most priced real estate is owned by Chinese. Uh, Indians, of course, there are some well-known investors like Adani and Jindal, but apart from that, you need to attract many more individual investors who can invest with the same degree of speed that the Chinese have demonstrated. So I think there are opportunities, and now at this time, where the Australians themselves will probably put barriers into place to ensure that Chinese do not take over weak or companies which fall into distress because of the pandemic, or do not buy real estate and property beyond a certain value, there's an opportunity for India. So I would suggest that this is a model which can succeed, because once you've broken through this barrier of mistrust, why did Tony Abbott succeed in India much more than he succeeded in any other relationship? Because he was the one who actually implemented the decision to supply uranium, although the uranium hasn't actually physically arrived, but to supply uranium to India. And a question was posed to him in Mumbai. I was there when a journalist asked him, he says, but you're going to supply uranium to a non-NPT signatory? So he says, but we trust India. In that one sentence, he was able to overcome years of a trust deficit. I think that trust deficit has been overcome, and the gulf with China has only widened in terms of trust. We should build on this social capital to ensure that Indians have influence in real terms, in terms of numbers. At the moment, Indians still count for far less than the Chinese do in terms of population, in terms of parliament. There's not a single elected member of parliament in Indian member who's directly elected to a parliament, unless that's changed in the last couple of years, while the Chinese have huge numbers, including those who, now it's demonstrated, were paid money by Chinese, by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, who doled out money to others and bribed people. It's including those of Iranian origin, Sam Dastyari and company. It's shameful what's happened in Australia and the way in which the Chinese have subverted the political system to a great deal. I think for Australia's own democracy, it's important that you create a level playing field in which Indians at least have a good chance to become a potent force within China, within Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Mattu.
I need to go now. Thank you so much, Anilesh, for this fantastic discussion.
Yeah. So now we may invite Mr. Wadhwa. Wadhwa sir, you have heard all gentlemen, and probably now we all can conclude that Quad is a multi-layered partnership. Whenever we try to put it on paper, so it has to be more strategic from the economic as well as from the sociological point of view, as Mr. Mattu was articulating. So what do you think that what should be India's strategy, to push, this partnership and take something for, the peace and prosperity of the region?
Anilesh, let me just pick up a few points that were mentioned in addition to what I said earlier.
Yes,
I think what matters for the four partners in the Quad is very much the concept of rule of law and democracy, and flowing from that, a free and open Indo-Pacific. So that is the binding factor here, and any violation of that principle will obviously bring them together even further. And that is a starting point. And I think if we talk about the concrete areas of cooperation, I already mentioned 5 such areas to you in which the Quad has started to work. There are many other ideas about how this could be expanded in the future. But I think what holds the most promise, given the fact that there is an amount of aggression which is happening because of the Chinese factor in the region, joint production of defense equipment and technology, especially over-the-horizon technologies and technologies which aid in the naval field, will be the most important ones in the immediate future. Add to that is the joint production of space components and shipbuilding. And here I'm drawing upon my own experience with talking to companies on both sides in India and Australia, because I've been working on an Australia economic strategy report for the past 1 year, as far as India is concerned, which is complete now and will be hopefully released in the near future, where there is a big complementarity in terms of collaboration in space as well as in chip building. The capability is there in India, and there is a requirement of niche technology in terms of collaborations. Similarly, in terms of the value chain, and in terms of I think somebody's mic is gone on.
So
Okay.
it's done, sir.
Sorry. So then, in terms of relocation of value chains, and the fact that we need to concentrate more on relocation, I think, as everybody else has said, it's not an easy task at all. The economies of Australia, Japan, and India are very closely interlinked with the Chinese economy. And obviously, as the Chinese ambassador reminded us just 2 days ago, when he spoke at the Institute of Chinese Studies here in New Delhi, the dependence of Indian companies on Chinese API in terms of pharmaceuticals, auto components for the automobile industry, solar energy equipment, which is a emerging field in India. All these will require some amount of effort and some amount of time to relocate. So one should be prudent about this, not be emotional, but at the same time look for opportunities where the three countries can cooperate. Three other countries can cooperate with India, and India is already working with them in most of these areas. Now that there are some new policies that the government has taken out in terms of the reforms which have happened post COVID, and also the fact that 10 in areas have been identified for the Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is basically not an isolationist policy, but actually looks at collaborations with the outside world, how to increase those collaborations. That can be leveraged in the future. With Australia, one particular field that I would like to single out is the cooperation in LNG. And that is because India has opened up its eastern seaboard ports now, and is also working on infrastructure for distribution, which brings down the cost of LNG shipment from Perth and Darwin and into the eastern coast of India, and will be most competitive compared to the imports which used to happen solely from West Asia in the past. And I think the LNG companies are looking at that very seriously. The other area which is very important for collaboration with Australia is in mineral resources and processing of lithium, which has to happen in India, given the e-mobility program in India, for which the NITI Aayog has already approved at least 3 such facilities and set aside funds for that purpose. And the reforms which have happened in the mining industry also give Australia a very big opportunity to work here with Indian companies. Conversely, I would say that Indian companies must look at investments in Australia in agriculture and food technology processing, because that's one area which both sides can benefit from. And there is a requirement of that technology in India as well. The fifth issue I wanted to talk about was the issue of interoperability. Now, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we already have these agreements which have been signed with United States and Australia, but at the same time, we're also working on, or actually we finished work on similar agreement with Japan, which should be agreed upon once the next summit takes place. But here, how to take this forward is a question. And I think that interoperability offers us a number of possibilities. First of all, the use of each other's facilities, like the Andaman Islands, for instance, the Coco Islands, which is with Australia. And we could use of each other's facilities in order to increase and enhance the reach, and also to make sure that the capabilities are enhanced as far as both India and Australia are concerned. And similarly, for underwater technologies, I think all the four Quad countries can work together in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the Indian Ocean, where the Chinese presence is going to only increase in the near future. Sixth issue is the alternatives to BRI. And here I talked briefly about the Blue Dot Initiative. We also have the Build in the Area Act of the United States. We have the Australian funds which have been set aside for development in the Pacific Island states. India has its own program for FIPIC, which is a grant in aid which is given every year. There's a rollover facility so that those funds have accumulated. What is needed to be done is to pick up 2 or 3 such immediate projects, which could act as a model for an alternative to the Chinese BRI. And one should be done at least in the, 1 or 2 should be done in the Pacific Island states, where it's a new area of opening up as far as China is concerned. And I think in the ASEAN itself, the Quad needs to work on a model project, which should not be a very elaborate project, but should be completed in a given time frame, so as to instill that confidence that there is an alternative to BRI. So that is something that the countries can easily agree on. And finally, we were talking about Indian students as far as Australia is concerned. I think skilling is a great area. 400,000 people in India need to be skilled by 2022. And here again, there is specialized training which is required in the food processing industry, in mining, in critical minerals processing, etc. These are all areas where Australian institutions can play a very big role, especially in the light of what has happened with the new education policy, which has just been unveiled 2 days ago in India. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Wadhwa. Thank you very much. It was great, wonderful insight. I thank all 4 gentlemen who have joined us. It was a great understanding and great learning for all of us. So we have few questions for you. First is from Sugato Hazra. Sugato ji is a corporate analyst and corporate strategist. He want to ask a question. Sugato ji, you can unmute yourself and ask your question. And please switch on the video as well. I think he's not been able to do it. The second is from RNB. Sir, can you please introduce yourself and ask the question? Hello?
I have managed to unmute myself.
Yeah, please, Sugato Dada.
In fact, a very nice discussion, particularly to Amitabh. What you said is right, but do you think the government of India is thinking on that line, and are they keen to do that, what you are recommending?
Your question is pointed to whom, sir? Sugato Dada?
Basically to Amitabh and to others as well, if they have any idea on that.
Amitabh has stepped out. He had to leave for Jaipur. Can you repeat your question?
In that case, can Malcolm answer that? Does he think that India and Australia are moving towards what have been the suggestion by all 4 of you actually?
Malcolm, he's asking that do you visualize India and Australia deepening the relationship in near future, as others were also suggesting? So what is your perspective on Indo-Australian relationship?
Look, I think we will. The very fact that the Quad is back after being abruptly terminated thanks to the mistakes of the former PM Kevin Rudd, I think is a good sign. We have taken this very decisively. We're thinking very geopolitically in terms of our foreign and defence policy. We recognise the importance of India as a partner. So I certainly do see us strengthening our relationship going forward. Obviously, we have to do it in a fairly considered and careful manner, but I don't see us reverting course and going back to where we were in 2007. So, I think that, yes, the signs are very positive, and there is a broad front there for strengthening the relationship across a range of areas, not just in terms of defense, but also in terms of foreign and economics and trade and students and tourism and all of those areas.
And RNB, you wanted to ask, please introduce yourself and ask your question briefly.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I do apologize. I did have a microphone problem earlier. Now, my question is more towards the Indian experts. I'm an expat living in Australia, and now I shouldn't call myself expat because I call Australia home now. My question is more related to the infrastructure deficit that India having compared to the other three partners, Japan, US, and Australia. And if you ask any small to medium Australian businessman, for example, a small winery wanted to, export some wines to India, how difficult it is, the red tape associated with it, and the infrastructure. What steps India is taking, and is there anything built into those treaty that's done between four countries? That is a minimum agreement on those infrastructure deficit as well as the removal of those red tape, so the businesses can flourish between those four partners, and that could help them to overcome some of the business issues we're having with China. Thank you.
Mr. Wadhwa, if you want to answer, because you were the only one who worked with the government.
Yes, I
Please.
could answer that. Yes, I mean, I think he's right about the issue about infrastructure deficit in India, and India is fully committed to address that shortcoming. In fact, as far as Australia is concerned, we have the investments which are taking place in India by companies like Macquarie, etc., and also into the National Infrastructure Investment Fund from Australia through the pension funds are all directed at bridging this infrastructure deficit. Now, as you know, the pace of highway construction in India and concentration on ports, etc., is the focus of attention at the moment, just because it's important that any production which takes place or manufacturing which takes place has a quick outlet for sales within the market as well as outside. So hopefully we'll get there. It's going to take some time, and with the cooperation of companies from Australia and Japan, in fact, and the United States, this is being addressed. But the question of wines that you raised is a totally unrelated issue with this. I'll say that because, as far as wines are concerned, India has duties across the board on liquor and wines with the rest of the world. This is also an issue with the European Union, which we are talking about in the prospective free trade agreement. With Australia, we do not have a free trade agreement. And these talks were stopped in 2013 pending the RCEP agreement. But I think one of the issues that need to be addressed now is to restart the free trade agreement talks between India and Australia, in which case the issues of agriculture, duties on agriculture products, wines, which you mentioned, and also, dairy, for instance, which are of concern to Australia, could be addressed. Along with the Indian concerns about duties on gems and jewelry, for instance, or petroleum products or textiles. So both sides have their own concerns about, how difficult it is to penetrate the other market. And despite that, there is some amount of trade which does take place, which just goes to show that there is an interest and a complementarity. So I think, that's one area of focus. My own report that I've prepared has strongly recommended that we restart these negotiations and complete them as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question from Sabyasachi Das. If he has rejoined, he can ask about FTAs. Sabyasachi? If he is not online, so I can ask him on his behalf that he has asked on the chat room as well, that whether India and Australia should progress the reprogress the free trade agreement negotiations, and specifically what should be the focus on the agriculture side. I believe Malcolm is a more strategic expert, and he might not be able to speak on the trade aspect. It's very complicated. Mr. Wadhwa, if you want
Yes,
to step
Anilesh,
in.
I think I did answer that partly, but I mean, definitely the FTA with Australia, between Australia and India, must be not only explored. I think we left off the negotiations halfway in 2013. The discussions have taken place already, and the areas of concern have already been identified. So I think it's a question of building upon those negotiations now and taking those forward. Um, Agriculture sector, as I mentioned earlier, also is an area of great potential, not only for Indian companies in Australia who could invest there, but also Australian companies who could invest in India in two areas. In fact, in food processing, because of the facilities that India is providing today in its food parks across the 43 food parks that India has set up, and also in respect of confectionery and consumer goods which are required in India today for the main market and also for exports to the neighboring markets. So I think there is no question about that. It's a win-win situation, and we should pursue that.
Thank you very much. I think this is good enough. Most of the questions which were there in the chat room are being answered. So thanks, gentlemen. It was really good, listening to all of you. I have read many of your papers. I have, got insight today as well. So I'm sure, our audience, although because of the technical glitch, many of our friends couldn't join us, but I'm sure the organizers will share the video link with them. And if they have certain question, my personal request would be that I will email it to you, and probably if you get some time out, so please respond to them. And with a deep apologies because of the technical glitch, I thank you all. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Rajiv Bhai. Thank you, Mr. Wadhwa. Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you.
And I'll also thank Mr. Mattu over the phone. Thank you very much. Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hope to see you soon.
ਚਲੋ ਜੀ ਮੁਬਾਰਕ ਅਮਨਲੇਸ਼ ਜੀ ਮੁਬਾਰਕਾਂ
ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ ਸਰ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮੁਬਾਰਕ ਕਿਸ ਦੀ ਲੈ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ ਕੀ ਦੇ ਰਹੇ ਸੀ ਤਾਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਦੱਸੋ ਹੁਣ
ਇਹ ਬਹੁਤ ਵੱਡੀ ਮੁਬਾਰਕ ਹੈ ਜੀ
ਦੱਸੋ ਸਰ ਲੱਡੂ ਖਵਾਓ
ਹਾਂ ਖਵਾਓ ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ
ਮੁਬਾਰਕਾਂ ਬਹੁਤ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ
ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ ਆਲ ਦ ਬੈਸਟ
ਥੈਂਕ ਯੂ ਜੀ